like our public service message. Um, all right, so this event and the recording and the making sure that there's closed captions on YouTube after we post this on YouTube is made possible by the Postgres Development Conference or pgconf.dev and their gold level sponsors. Those are Google, AWS, Huawei, Microsoft, and my employer also EDB. We have a couple more of these events coming up in the next couple of weeks leading up to the PGConf Dev in Montreal in May. And these are the ones that are still, like coming up. So if you're not part of the meetup group yet, which I think you are, because otherwise, how would you have joined this meetup? But if you have friends and family that you want to invite to these, then definitely make sure they sign up for the meetup group. Today, we have Peter Eisentraut joining us, my colleague, about implementing an extension search path. So really looking forward to that chat as well. We'll have time towards the end to do like a Q&A or if there's any shout outs that anyone still wants to do. But if you, in the meantime, like while the talk is going on, have any questions or suggestions, make sure you post them in the chat. Everybody should have the opportunity to post stuff in the chat. And if it's like really vital to you understanding the story that Peter is telling you, then I'll try and interrupt and see if we can get an answer for you then. I think that is it for me, so I'll stop sharing the slides so that we can switcheroo.
Okay, thank you. Do you want me to share now?
100%. Yes.
Here we go. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. And I'm going to talk about current project of me and a couple of people I've worked with. And that will hopefully ship with Postgres 18 in a few months. So, what do I know about extensions? I was not introduced, I guess some people know me. I work on Postgres, a Postgres developer. Um, and So I wanted to say, like, what do I know about extensions, right? I'm a Postgres core developer, but I've developed a few extensions in my time. Here's a list of extensions that I've built over the years. Some of those are experiments more or sort of one-offs. Some of those are actually used in production. So I've worked on a bunch of extensions. I've also contributed to well-known extensions, or FCE back in the day, PG Logical and BDR and PG failure slots, at, sort of at EDB and previously second quadrant. So those are obviously used widely and in important production environments. I also wrote a sort of an extension installation manager called PEX at one point, which is the point of that one was actually that just to do it in one shell script, so you don't have any dependencies. It's just a shell script, and you can say PEX install, or FC, and it installs it. This is also more of a proof of concept in a sense, but it was actually like quite useful sometimes for development when you just need an extension, you don't know where to get it. You just do that. And then I wrote, again, this is even more experimental, but it was this then follow-on project called AutoPEX, which is um, a plugin, a module that you load into Postgres, which then automatically installs an extension if you need it. So if you call create extension or FC, for example, and you don't have it installed, then it calls out PEX, downloads it, installs it. Obviously, highly insecure and dubious in terms of modern software distribution practice, but it does work, right? So you can just run create extension and it just installs it if you don't have it. So that kind of works. So anyway, so I've worked on in various aspects of these over time. If you're interested in any of these projects, they're all under my GitHub uh, account, Peter E. So you can find all of these there if you want. Anyway, so in the context of this presentation, this was essentially not my idea. People came to me and asked me to work on this. And as it sort of worked out, multiple people came to me with their problems or questions, and then it turned out it was all the same question. So these are the problems I was approached about. So the first one is extension management in the Kubernetes environment. And this is something we'll hear about in a future talk in this series in more detail. So Gabriele Bartolini from the Cloud Native PG project, he approached me, and so they're having, the issue in Kubernetes environment is that if you launch, Postgres service, the installation is you don't install packages, you have a pre-baked disk images essentially, right? And the disk images contain the software that you need. So there's a Postgres server and maybe some backup software in that image. And then if you want to install an extension, then and the extension is not in that image, you need to then rebuild the image with the extension. And it's very inconvenient, right? So the ideal scenario would be that you have some kind of additional disk images for the extensions, and then you just somehow attach them, right? So I'm hand waving through the Kubernetes terminology, and again, there will be a presentation about that in more detail. But I think the idea is clear, right? You want to have these immutable disk images that contain your pieces of software, and if you want to install more of them, you just want to have these disk images sort of augment them together, and that doesn't work at the moment. So that was problem number one. The problem number two is I was approached by a maintainer of the Postgres app project, and I see one of them is also here. That's great. So Postgres app is a Mac binary distribution for Postgres. So, it's a nice sort of user-friendly binary distribution for Postgres. And this is sort of a similar problem you have on Postgres, that you have on Mac OS, these .app files that are a way to distribute software. And they're this sort of weird hybrid between, it's sort of a zip file, let's say, in a way, with files in it. But you can also look into it as a directory, so it's kind of weird. But it's basically an archive of sorts with software in it. And in this case, it has Postgres in it, and it integrates nicely into your system. But again, if you want to install an extension, that doesn't work as easily, because you would need to then open up that archive and stick it in there somehow, or overwrite files in there. And there's also a tie-in with the way these packages are signed by Apple, and if you mess with the files that are in that package, then your signatures become invalid and so on. This is the way it's been explained to me. I hope this was approximately accurate. But you're already getting the idea, right? There's the same problem that you have this sort of base bundle of software that is immutable, or that you want to keep immutable, and you want to add things to it, which doesn't work. And then the third problem I was asked to solve came from the Debian package maintainer, who will also speak later in this presentation series. What he wanted to do was to run the tests of an extension while the package is being built, right? That makes sense. You want to run the tests of the software that you're building the package for in general. But in order to do that, you have to install the extension into the normal file system location, right? And so that seems bad. You don't want to install the software while you're into the main system while you're building it. So that's bad. And so what he actually did, he wrote like a custom patch to be able to do that, which then my work was ultimately, well, not actually based on, but sort of inspired by. So those are the problems I was approached of. I had some problems I wanted to solve myself based on my experience with working with extensions. So while I was working on these various extensions over the years, one thing that never worked is that you could never run make check because that is not supported by that, PGXS build system that is being used. Again, it's the same issue. It's sort of very similar, or essentially a subset of the Debian problem we just talked about, right? You want to run a test of the software before you install it. But Postgres can only load an extension from a fixed location. And so this doesn't work. And it's very annoying because then that makes the software development cycle much more complicated. You always have to then run make all, make install, make sure you have a server running, make install check, and then you want to test it against various different server versions. Usually you have to run this in some weird loop, or I've written custom scripts and stuff all around this, but it was never satisfactory. It should just work. All right. So that's a problem I definitely wanted to solve. The next problem is, they're all sort of subsets of each other, right? That if you have Postgres installed from a package, like an RPM package, for example, and then you build an extension locally, you have the way has worked until now, you have to install that into the directory locations that are controlled by your operating system, right? If you have Postgres under user, then the extensions also have to be installed under user. Whereas you probably want to install them under user local or somewhere else, right? So you want to keep those locally built things separately, but that's not possible. And finally, this is a bit more complicated to explain, but I'm as my desktop, I'm mainly using macOS at the moment, and the Homebrew package manager is widely used there. But the way it works, it doesn't support extensions very well at all. It's really weird because the way it works is that each package is installed into a separate subdirectory, and then it's all symlinked together. And that works just fine, right? Your sort of bin directory is just a bunch of symlinks to different subdirectories, and that works because then you can just swap these things out and upgrade packages quite easily. So that's just a design choice, and it's fine. But again, if you want to install an extension, the extension would be its own package. Let's say PostGIS, for example, right? Then that would go into its own directory. But that's not the directory where Postgres would look for it. So you would have to basically install it into the directory structure that belongs to the other package, and that just doesn't work. It just does not fit with that system at all. So there's weird hacks at the moment, and it's not satisfactory. It doesn't work at all. So, and it turned out, all of these things have sort of came up over the years, and some of these I showed on the previous page, people have approached me about, and I realized these are essentially all the same problem, right? And the extension file location is hard-coded to be inside the Postgres installation tree. So here, as an example, and this is, might be different, but it's usually under something user share PostgreSQL extension or something like that. And you can't install them anywhere else. And if you want to, keep this location, managed by the operating system or managed by your package management or in some kind of immutable disk image, you can't do that. And so these are essentially all the same versions of the same problem. And so that's why I kind of got engaged and tried to find a solution that addresses all of them. So, and I had worked on this already before, a long time ago, and then someone broke it along the way, and now I'm fixing it again. If you go way back before extensions as such existed in Postgres, extensions were implemented in, I think it was, which one was it? Postgres 9.1 or 9.3?
9.1.
9.1, yeah. So before that, when you wanted to install something like that, right? A piece of software that contains that consists of a shared library object and some SQL to install it, right? That's kind of what you have. Before you had extensions, you had to install the shared library object into a predetermined location, just like you do now. And then in addition, you had to run that SQL file by hand, basically. You run psql -f install or fc.sql or something like that, right? And extensions basically made that a little nicer, but it's the same idea underneath. And as it says here, 2001, I essentially realized this problem already and implemented a configuration setting called dynamic library path, which allows you to set a different location for your shared library. So then you can say, dynamic library path equals user local my stuff / something, right? And then it would look there. And then the SQL file is just where it is because you run it manually, right? You would then run psql -f user local my stuff something SQL. And so that fixed that problem at the time. And then when extensions were implemented, I was essentially not paying attention, or nobody was paying attention, and essentially that was a really super nice feature, of course, but it essentially broke this previously available feature because then you couldn't install your extensions any way you wanted to. You were tied to this specific library location, this specific file system location. And dynamic library path still existed. You could still set it somewhere, but you couldn't really make much use of it. I mean, you could make use of it for things that are not extensions, right? If you have some kind of plugin module or modules that install hooks, you could still do that, but not for extensions that consist of, a set of SQL scripts and control files and dynamic library paths. So that was kind of where that was broken. And as I was being approached about these things, I basically realized that, yeah, that was just a problem and we should just now fix that. So the recent history went as follows. In April 2024, which is, just about a year ago now, David Wheeler started a hackers thread, basically sort of suggesting Christoph Berg's Debian patch as a starting point for discussions. Like, here's this thing, shouldn't we do something about this? And there was, a fair amount of discussion. I was not involved really at the time. This was just after, feature freeze, and so I wasn't really paying attention too much about this, but the discussion was quite lively, and a lot of people pitched in and had sort of their ideas and thoughts about it. And so a lot of important, filtering work was done at that time. Later in September, then Gabriele from he's also my colleague at EDB, but who works on Cloud Native PG, approached me about this and said, like, hey, this is important over there. We need this to make extensions useful in the Kubernetes environment. And he said, like, can you work on this? I said, yeah, sure. In a couple of months, I might have time. But it sort of turns out at PGConf EU, we kind of had a big brain trust meeting of various people who basically all came like, hey, I heard you're working on extension control path. I also need that, right? So this was Gabriele was there, and then Tobias Bussmann from Postgres app was there, and Christoph was also there. And I was like, yeah, I really need this extension control path to make this work. So I made sure to talk to everybody there and sort of made sure I sort of got them like, so if we did this, would this work for you? And then we kind of had a good idea of how this should work. And then, yeah, in November, the first patch was posted, and last week it was committed. So that's hopefully, I think there's still a little bit of discussion of some details, and we certainly still have some time before the release to fine tune this, but the main work is hopefully done. So get some credits here. This is the commit that I did last week. So this the fact that the presentation was scheduled for the day gave me additional motivation to get it done, obviously. So that was kind of good. I want to give some credits to people who reviewed it. Obviously, David did a lot of reviews and feedback in general. My colleague Mateus, who I think I saw him earlier, he's also here on the call, did help me quite a bit with sort of finishing the patch. And then Gabriele, Marco, and Nicolo down there who work on Cloud Native PG, they did a large amount of testing. They set up a whole sort of sandbox environment of making sort of test images for extensions and simulating the entire process of attaching these to the main image. And again, I'm butchering the terminology, but I'm just trying to explain it in general terms. So they did basically the whole end-to-end testing of what that would then look like with Cloud Native PG. And again, that will, I assume, be discussed when Gabriele presents in a few weeks. These are the stats from the patch, and the reason I show this is, it's not big, but what I did is use the same infrastructure and mechanisms that already existed for the dynamic library path. And that's the code that's here in dfmgr there in the middle. That's where this path search is implemented. And then, of course, in extension.c, there's some code that basically just a bunch of utility functions. Like if you want to list all the extensions and list all the versions of all the extensions, right? Those utility functions exist and they needed to be updated to do the path search and so on. Everything else is pretty straightforward. There's just a few, configuration settings being added to the documentation and the sample files and so on. So it's not that much really. But one thing we also did was add tests for this down there on the test extension. So we wrote some tests to actually, make sure this works. And, one thing to make sure it works, but the other thing is if we want to make, changes or we find problems with it, or we want to make, develop this further in the future, we have a record of how it works, which is, this is why you write tests. But just wanted to point that out because we didn't really have that before. And this was quite helpful to build confidence that we know how this works. All right, so how does it work? So let's say you have your Postgres installation in, sort of a standard Linux file system package controlled location. So you have this is none of the actual packages look like that, I believe, but this is sort of a good example. So you have your stuff on the user bin, you have the shared libraries on the user lib something, you have the extension control files and SQL files on the user share or something. So that's your base installation. And then you want to install your extension into some other place to keep these things separate. So you have, user local my stuff, for example, in this case. And another thing that this patch implemented is that you can actually now also do this. When you build an extension, you can write make install prefix something. Before that, you couldn't do that, but there was also no point of doing that because if you install it somewhere else, you couldn't do anything with it there. So now you can load it from somewhere else, but you can also install it there, which obviously also is the two important sides of that. And then you set those two settings down there. So the dynamic library path is an existing configuration setting. So you set that to where your lib directory is, and then the extension control path is a new setting. That's the new setting, the titular setting of this talk, where you tell it where your extension control files are. So the way so first of all, there's these placeholders, they're libdir and system. They're basically mean, this is sort of the system location, and then the other locations are your other locations. and it's separated by colon, and it's semicolon on Windows. And extension control path, we had some arguments about what exactly it should be called, and people kind of continue to have possibly different opinions on that. What it does is it looks in those directories for the control file. And then wherever it finds the control file, from there it loads all the other files. And there's a fairly complicated mechanisms in there. There's obviously the actual SQL files, but there's also these auxiliary control files, which I didn't even know that they existed, right? So you can have version-specific control files, and so it's a fairly complicated system there. So we wanted to be clear, like what is happening is the main control file is searched in these directories, and then wherever it's found, that's where it looks for all the other things. So you can't have the control file in one path and then the SQL files in another part of the path. That's not how it works. So that solves problem number 5. Let's see what problem number 5 was. I forgot. Right. So this is the basic problem that you don't no longer have to install the extensions in the directories that are ostensibly controlled by the operating system or your package manager. So then how would Debian packaging use this? So I got this information from Christoph. He figured out how to do this. He just said like, oh, I did this, and that's how it works. So basically during packaging or doing the packaging scripts that build the Debian packages, you just pass these options here to set the control path and the dynamic library path and these versions, and then it works. So this was confirmed that this addresses his problem. He no longer has to carry his custom patch. This solves problem number 3. So the question then people ask is like, oh, why do we have 2? Or maybe you've asked yourself that. Why do we need 2 settings? So we have the dynamic library path, we have the extension control path. Isn't that kind of the same thing? Kind of, yes. But in general, it is not guaranteed that these 2 things are in a fixed relative location, right? Let's go back to our fake example here. So we have the libraries in userlib PostgreSQL and the SQL and control files in user share PostgreSQL, for example. Now you could say, why don't we just set it to user, or for example, why don't we just set the path to user local my stuff, and it should figure out the subdirectories. That would be nice, but it doesn't quite work in general because it's not guaranteed that those are the subdirectories, right? There could be, for example, lib64, for example, right? Or some other, so architecture-specific subdirectory names, or people can just name them whatever they want. So this is maybe marginal, but it is possible. So you need to keep that in mind, that the subdirectory structure is not necessarily fixed. So we need 2 settings. And the way I thought about this, if you compile C code, you also have 2 settings. And if you think about it, it's exactly the same thing. Right? When you compile C code, you always have to do -I and -L. I for the include files, L for the lib files. Again, this is basically the same thing, right? The include files, also the text files that describe the interfaces, and the libraries are the libraries. So it's exactly, and again, you need 2 options because you can't just tell the compiler, oh, look for it in user local, because the subdirectories could be different, right? There could be architecture-specific lib directories. That's a common case. So you need those 2 settings. Usually they go in parallel, and maybe, again, this is what I did. This was, my design, so to speak. If somebody has a plan on how to do it simpler, follow-up patches are welcome. But the main point of why this approach was taken is also to get it done basically in a few months, right? I started thinking about this, or I was contacted about this in September, and I started thinking about it seriously in October, November timeframe. And that's quite late in the development cycle to start a feature like this, which I thought it would be more controversial in terms of people haven't really complained that this sort of breaks security of extensions or anything like that. So I was a little bit afraid of that. So I wanted to really base it on an existing facility that we already had. And that's why I wanted to make sure it works exactly in parallel to the other path that we already have and that has existed for a long time and was designed for this exact purpose. So that was also the reason why we chose this sort of path of least resistance, perhaps. So this is the solution progress for the 6 problems that I described initially. So the Cloud Native PG folks obviously have accompanied this project actively and have already prototyped the integration solution, and presumably we'll hear about some of that at the meeting on May 7th, where Gabriela will talk about this. Postgres app I haven't been in touch with, but one of the maintainers is here, so maybe you can give feedback later. Debian is done as I described, and there will also be at the next meeting, maybe there will be some comment on that. One thing that's not fully implemented is the make check issue. I did send a follow-up patch about that, which is was a really quick prototype hack to do that, and people really liked it. So I'm slightly tempted to give it a push and try to get it into Postgres 18. So this is a work in progress, but there's sort of a way forward. The local install problem I said is done. Homebrew I haven't looked into. It's more complicated, and I'm also not very closely involved in the development of that. So I'll just be an outsider, maybe sending patches or suggestions at some point, maybe closer to when the release is closer and we've settled everything. So yeah, that's what I've done. I have some random other thoughts here just while I can talk to you about extensions. So a couple other things that are on my mind. I'm not actively working on these like right now, but I have worked on it in the past and I plan to work on it again. So basically the conversion of all the building to Meson is on my mind and other people's mind. So the first thing what we eventually want to do in Postgres is, right now we have 2 build systems. We have the make build system and the Meson build system, and all the production packages, as far as I know, are built with make. And eventually we want to move all of that over to Meson, but we need to essentially we want to test all the extensions against that and see if it still works. So as far as I know, it does work, right? There's nothing that really needs to be implemented, but we need to go through all the extensions and test them. Secondly, this is optional. I'm not saying this is a requirement, but you may wish to also build your own extensions using Meson. But that's in my mind not a requirement. You can also, some people use CMake or do whatever you want. But there's been some prototypes of that. So solutions for that exist if you're interested. And to facilitate the second point, there's been the proposal, which I think was well received, but it just needs to be fully implemented, is to provide a package config file to build against the server, right? So that in your build system, in your Meson build system, and CMake and Meson would work very well with that. Then you just say, like, here's a package config file to build against the server, do it. It's much easier than setting all the extensions, setting all the directories yourself, or extracting them from pgconfig and so on. So maybe that's something coming for the next release cycle, I think. Okay, so that's what I had. So extension control path is coming at this as of right now. It's coming in Postgres 18. What you can do is test and validate that against your use cases and help integration into the downstream users. Again, if you're sort of a packager or anything like that, you can make use of that. That is all for me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I think there is a little bit of discussion going on in the
Cool.
chats. I don't know if you can see it.
I saw it. I
And
wasn't following it, but I see it now.
no,
Yeah.
no,
So
you should like by all means. Like I think that that would have been just incredibly confusing. There was also some talk about getting someone in the Zoom call. So please don't. Um, how would you like to do this? Would you like me to try and find the questions, or do you just want to like read them out loud and reply to them
let's see
yourself?
here. Summit-driven development. That's definitely true. Yes, conference-driven development is definitely a thing. Um, do I have a link to the requirements gathering document? Well, no, these are just like notes. I have notes written down, but this is not like an actual document. I call it requirements gathering. It's very formal, but it's just chatting to various people, and someone at the next table overheard us talking. It's like, hey, I need that. Yeah. Oh, Christoph is here. Great. So I thought he could make it. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe also Christoph, please feel free to grab the mic and talk too.
Yeah, hello. So
Hi.
I tried to get this fixed or implemented or something at least once over the last 10 something-ish years and was basically shot down on grounds of security issues if people mess up their system, and what happens if you set the extension path to something, install an extension, and then set the path to something else, and then you can't upgrade, and all sorts of weird things that people can do with their system in order to break them. And thanks for ignoring all that bullshit and just getting it done, because it's an administrator level setting and people can do whatever they want with it. It does. So what I then did is just to implement that patch, and admittedly, I never got around to even try to put it upstream. So thanks, David, for pushing that ahead. It was clear that the Debian version of the patch wasn't acceptable because it was too limited. It made some assumptions about the directory structure of Debian packages. So it always included the prefix in the path. And that's why the path that you could see in that slide that Peter showed for a second, and where I put the link in, why the path names are very long there. So, okay. So I never managed to push it upstream. The feature that Peter implemented solves my problem. It does solve a lot of more problems. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Cool. What else do we have here? PGRX. Yeah, I don't have any. Wait, PGRX, is that for Rust? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I have no real knowledge about that. So yeah. And yeah, testing all extensions. What we've talked about is doing this through the Debian packaging system, because the idea was to just switch, maybe make a separate branch or a separate sub-repository of some sort, switch it to build with Meson, then rebuild all the extension packages, see what happens. I guess that's how far we've come. Doesn't actually mean they all work, I guess, but I guess most of them has tests, so you just want to test, see if it works. There's some really subtle problems that, well, the ones I know of have been fixed, but there's some things that certain compilation options are not substituted into the make files correctly. So then all your extensions are built without any optimizations, for example, without any O option. So I'm not really sure how to detect those automatically, but at least, just rebuild everything once might be an option, or just do it manually. I mean, there's not thousands of extensions. There's not even hundreds that are relevant, right? There's several dozens, and I think that's good coverage. So I don't know. That's a thing to figure out at some point.
Yeah, I guess that's me again, because you mentioned Debian.
Well,
I
yeah,
started.
we talked about this a little bit, yeah, but I don't want to make this necessarily your problem.
Yeah, sure, sure. But I realized that doing it on the packaging side makes sense because we all have these tests running. So I was looking into it. The first time I tried, I stopped once I realized that Meson doesn't support LLVM yet. And the
Yeah.
second time I tried, I just diffed the generated make files to see if there's any differences that look suspicious. And at that point, I should just continue and do compilation run and see what the tests are doing and stuff. So my hope would just be that I could run diff on the result. Also, the problem is compiling with Postgres with autoconf once and then with Meson the second time, and then see if it has an impact on the extensions compiled. But my idea was that if I'm just running diff on the two compilations and there's no difference, there's no point in testing because they are identical anyway.
Oh, you
But
want the actual compilation, like make file output to be the same.
yeah, so
Yeah,
then
okay, yeah, sure, that would
wouldn't have
work.
to run that test, but the diff was a bit too big to be readable. There was lots of
Mm,
white space noise in there, but there were also some actual changes. Some were not really bad, like in some points, variables were using fully qualified path for make directory or something, and in some
mm.
points not. But maybe we can just work on making that difference smaller, and then arguing about correctness is easier.
Yeah, that's probably, I think that sounds like a good approach.
Hello, maybe I can give some feedback or from Postgres app. So thank you very much. I think this solves a lot of problems that we have had with extensions over the years, especially because it allows us to separate the extensions and the main Postgres distribution. Because right now, uh, uh, so just talking about Postgres app, right now we basically have to decide which extensions to include, and we can't offer additional extensions when people ask for them, like without shipping them for everyone. And so that's a big win. One question I'm wondering about is the use case of people building their own extensions. As far as I understand, you need to, or the examples you showed, you have to provide the prefix. And one thing I'm wondering is like, is there some way to make this like to give a default value for the prefix? Like in PG config or in something like, so that people who just type make install automatically get some path that makes sense.
That might be a interesting follow on. I'm not sure. I'll make a note about it. I'm not sure
I'm
exactly how you would do it, but we could think of a way at least so you could
I'm just thinking that
patch it.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, because a big problem is that a lot of people who try things, they don't follow the instructions for the specific Postgres. So for example, if we write documentation how to build extensions and people on a completely different system, like people Google stuff and they get instructions, like they'll just try random paths. And if like right now right now if you just type make install, it works on most systems because it just built into the standard uh, directories.
Yeah,
So
David
yeah,
puts it like, should there be a different default extension
yeah.
solution? Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably not an unreasonable direction. I'm a little bit hesitant to kind of, make that sort of a proposal right now, sort of on short
No,
notice.
that's yeah.
But I think that's something we should maybe think about once this is stabilized. I think for your, Postgres app use case, I think you could probably even implement that yourself with a 1 or 2 line patch, so that at least, if you install Postgres app, then somebody tries to build an extension, they get a reasonable location.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we could. I haven't looked at it into detail. Tobias Buschmann is more has followed the process more.
Yep. Just if I could throw in there, Jacob, my assumption was that Postgres app would do something like designate like the application support directory and preferences and library as like where extensions would be installed. And yeah, there could be some
Yeah.
like patch to the PGXS to by default put stuff there.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be nice.
Right,
So
Robert, that's the
I'm
big question here. Okay. Sorry. No, sorry. I thought you were done. Finish, please.
Yeah.
Jakob.
No, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, so
And for the
Robert is asking
timeline,
the all-important question here. What do we think the security consequences of this patch are? Well, one of the premises is we already have dynamic library path, which works exactly the same way, and there haven't been any concerns about that. Well, maybe there's been concerns, but nothing that was acted on. So if you set the path to somewhere where anybody can write stuff, then yeah, sure, that's not so good. But that's the same as anything. So yeah, certainly there was concerns, at least for as I was reading through this discussion that led up to it and so on. It's like, yeah, okay, somebody is going to have some security question. So I really wanted to base it on this existing mechanism that we have and not invent something completely new. And so far nobody has objected to it. But yeah, of course you can make a mess of it if you go in set extension control path equals /temp. Yeah, that's probably not good, but don't do that. I mean, that's
I think in part the XZ exploit kind of made people more receptive to this patch because we want to reduce the number of patches that packaging maintainers have to maintain.
yeah, obviously this is something people do and people want to, better we have one solution that people then can use and that we at least we understand, as opposed to then everybody going out and figuring out their own complicated solutions.
Cool. Any more questions, comments?
Peter, I think there are still some issues with the kind of behavior of module dir from PGXS and directory in the control file that this doesn't quite work with this extension. We had some thoughts on how to approach those issues.
There's a open question. I guess I've been meaning to, so for those who are not following this, so that there's an existing, I guess, rarely used feature that you can, in the control file, you can specify a directory options, which then specifies where other files are located. And if this doesn't work the way you think it should, maybe, or it's not clear what that should do if you find it in a path somewhere. I guess it's so rarely used that we might maybe just get rid of it. That was one of the options, right? In my mental model, right, I had this mental model of how does the C compiler work. In my mental model, this is right, setting an R path on something, right? If you set an absolute R path somewhere and it's not going to work if you move the thing to a different place in the path. I'm not sure if that's a good analogy, but I was, it sort of has similar consequences. If you hard code absolute paths, then path search is not going to work. But yeah, that's on the list certainly to look into. Let's make sure we find a reasonable solution there.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I discovered last week that the part of this patch where you're stripping out $libdir and the extension makefile that was in modules, I think. That also needs to be done when you use our path to install an extension and point to extensions today with Postgres 17.
Okay.
So yeah, happy to see that one go.
Yeah, thanks for fixing that part. I was always wondering why this was broken the way it was broken. It looked very weird, and it turned out it was just broken and not me not understanding it.
I think it might have been a documentation oversight back when extensions were added in 9.1 to say, this is how you list the modules. Anyway, this is great. I'm super excited for this patch and where it's going, the promise for stuff in the future. Just from your list of the 6 issues it addresses, it's obviously, I think, something that covers a variety of pain points. So appreciate you doing that. Anyone else for the stuff for Peter? Next time in 2 weeks from now, I think, Christoph, you are going to be talking about extension packaging and apt.
Yes.
Excellent. 2 weeks after that, it'll be Gabriella on May 7th. Talking about CNPG.
Awesome. Looking forward to all of those.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Till next one.
Right.